We're continuing our series of podcasts on miracles. And today, Michael Kowalski and I are going to talk about a specific category of miracles validated by forensic science, for which science has no explanation. And that category is the manifestation of spirit to matter. Michael, I think that will probably sound very New Agey to most people.
It does, doesn't it? However, the so-called New Age movement, that really is simply a reawakening of an awareness of planes of existence beyond the physical. So, Jennifer, you mentioned manifestation, and according to the dictionary, that means to make evident or certain by showing something. And it's interesting that the equivalent word in Hindi refers to demonstration, expression, or materialization. So manifestation is actually a natural phenomenon.
So from your perspective, how does it work?
Well, we're familiar with solids, liquids and gases, but there's a fourth state of matter known to physics, which is called plasma. And plasma is effectively a soup of electrically charged particles, such as positively charged ions and negatively charged electrons, and this corresponds to the mental plane at both a personal and at a planetary level. Plasma responds to both electric and magnetic fields, and so when the electrically charged ions and electrons move, this produces an electric current. We often hear the term as above, so below, which refers to a correspondence between these planes and the mental interface which governs them.
So how would you define an interface?
It's where two systems meet, and the interface enables them to interact through communication. For example, we often hear the term interface used with computers, where it's used to describe something that enables two completely different components or systems to communicate with each other. Without an interface, these components would be unable to work together. So similarly, the spiritual and physical planes are completely different, but it's possible for them to become connected through an interface.
So, would you describe how this works?
It's a process of precipitation, and it involves acceleration and transfer of energy from the spiritual plane, and for that to then coalesce in matter.
Well, I personally witnessed physical manifestation in my work with Carol, so I know what you're saying is true.
Yes, and of course there's two ways in which manifestation can occur. One is through a focused intention, but this requires caution, it requires humility, and of course gratitude. Otherwise, it can be nothing more than an attempt to manipulate these forces for a self-serving purpose.
Of course.
The other is through grace, where it's given as an unearned gift, bestowed for the advancement of souls, providing evidence through an example. This is a spontaneous divine influence which operates for benevolent effect. And of course, that's what you actually witnessed.
So now, let's talk about Eucharistic miracles. Maybe you can start by us explaining what the Eucharist is.
The word Eucharist, it comes from the Greek word Eucharistia, which means thanksgiving. And we use the word Eucharist for the wafer of bread or the host, which is given when celebrating Holy Communion in Christian tradition.
And of course, most people are familiar with the Bible story of the Last Supper, when Jesus shared the bread and the wine with his disciples at the Jewish Passover feast.
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, the Bible tells us that he told his disciples about his coming death.
Yes.
And he broke the bread and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he also gave them wine to drink, saying, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you."
And of course, this became the Mass or the communion practiced daily in every Christian church throughout the world, when every member of the congregation receives the wafer and the wine. So now, can you describe Eucharistic miracles?
Yes, well, First, it's important to understand exactly what the Eucharist represents. As we know, the Christian Church, over the course of centuries, has evolved into many different denominations, and these have different interpretations of what actually occurs in the Mass. So if we take Catholics, for instance, Catholics traditionally believe in transubstantiation, which means that while the appearance of the bread and wine remains unaltered, when they are consecrated in the Mass, they're transformed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit.
And I understand that in Protestant denominations, they see the Mass as symbolic and believe in what they call consubstantiation, which means that the essence of the body and blood of Jesus sort of coexist in the consecrated host.
Yes, and that's perhaps easier to believe and accept. But what is interesting, however, in the majority of these cases of Eucharistic miracles, including the ones we're going to talk about, either the priest had doubts about the true presence of Christ in the Mass, or the offerings themselves were treated disrespectfully in some way. For example, they might have been stolen or dropped.
Oh, that's an interesting point. And the samples we're considering manifested physical changes. The bread transformed into actual blood and human tissue, and this didn't deteriorate even over centuries in some cases. We can imagine reports, can't we, of miraculous hosts being easily dismissed as fraudulent. I mean, who's going to believe it?
Yes, of course. That's certainly been the case, and it's been difficult to prove otherwise, at least until relatively recently. But of course, now we've got the technology that can test for the presence of blood. And there have been many instances where these tests have been performed. What's really interesting is they repeatedly confirm that the red stains that appeared in the bread, that they are real blood. And they've even been able to show the blood type AB, a rare blood group shared by only 3% of the population. It's important to stress, by the way, that these extraordinary changes of bread to flesh and blood, they've occurred as a demonstration only. They're not connected to hosts to serve to people in the congregation.
I think that's a really significant point, isn't it? That none of these miracles were connected to anything that was received by a member of the congregation.
That's right.
So what's the evidence then for Eucharistic miracles? Well, let's begin with the oldest one, which apparently is the miraculous host of Lanciano, which is an ancient Italian city.
Well, according to tradition, the town of Lanciano was the birthplace of Longinus, who was the Roman centurion who pierced the side of Jesus on the cross to ensure he was dead. And the town was actually named after the Italian word for spear, lancia. Now, Carol talked about this and the anatomical evidence that's found on the Shroud of Turin, I think in a previous podcast.
And Longinus is said to have had poor vision, but he regained his sight after touching his eyes with his blood-stained hands. And he's quoted in the Bible as saying, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." And he became a follower of Jesus, and he was canonized a saint.
In fact, 700 years after the crucifixion, there was a monastery dedicated to St. Longinus that was established in Lanciano, his hometown. In 750 AD, a miracle occurred when a monk who doubted the Catholic dogma of transubstantiation was celebrating Mass. And what happened was that when he said the words, "This is my body and this is my blood," he noticed the bread change in what appeared to him to be flesh, and the wine also changed to blood. Shortly afterwards, apparently the blood had coagulated into 5 globules of irregular shape, and that was interpreted as corresponding to the 5 wounds suffered by Jesus on the cross. Apparently the Archbishop was informed, and he ordered an investigation, and at the investigation they recorded the testimony of various witnesses. What had happened apparently was that the flesh and blood appeared to be human flesh and blood, and the 5 globules of blood they were weighed. And interestingly and remarkably, despite them all being different in size, they all recorded the same weight. And in fact, even when they were all weighed together, the weight was the same as each of the individual weights. After these tests, the flesh and the blood globules, they were placed in a reliquary and stored, but stored without any kind of hermetic seal.
And according to my notes, apparently in 1574, the relics were again examined, their appearance remained unchanged, with no physical sign of deterioration, and they were again weighed with exactly the same results.
That's right, and there's been tests since then. In fact, as recently as 1970, Pope Paul VI gave permission for some more forensic tests to be carried out. And these tests were done by Odoardo Linoli, who was a professor of anatomy and pathological histology, as well as head physician of the hospital of Arezzo. That professor was assisted by Ruggero Bertelli, who was professor emeritus of human anatomy at the University of Siena. And these two scientists, they showed that the flesh was human cardiac tissue and that the blood was human blood from blood group AB. Both of them confirmed that the sample could not have been taken from a cadaver because only a highly skilled pathologist could have obtained such a sample of heart muscle.
Gosh.
And in a case, it would have degraded rapidly after death. Of course, this sample that they were examining was centuries old. It hadn't been hermetically sealed and it was completely free of any preservatives. So it should have deteriorated. But instead, it had all the properties of fresh human flesh and blood.
Goodness. And in 1973, the Higher Council of the World Health Organization, which we know as WHO, appointed a scientific commission which verified Dr. Linoli's conclusions. And they published an extract of their research in December of 1976 stating, "Science, aware of its limits, stops in front of impossibility of giving an explanation."
Yes. In fact, Dr. Linoli did further tests in 1981. This time he was able to use more advanced medical equipment to repeat them. He found a few more details. Apparently, the flesh had the structure of the myocardium, which is the name given for the heart wall, and also the endocardium, which is a membrane of fibrous tissue which lines all the cardiac cavities. So in effect, what we're saying is it had the same appearance as the human heart.
Yes.
And similarly, the clotted blood, that had the same percentage ratios for blood proteins that are found in normal fresh human blood. And it also contained chlorides, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sodium and calcium, all of which are minerals that can be found in real human blood. Today, the tissue is still not decomposed. It remains on the altar of the church in Lanciano.
And science has repeatedly confirmed other Eucharistic samples to be of heart muscle and living blood.
Yes, they continue. And in fact, there is one that occurred in Buenos Aires in Argentina, which was mentioned in a previous podcast. This occurred as recently as 1996, and it was actually in the parish where Jorge Bergoglio, who is now known as Pope Francis, it's where Jorge Bergoglio was previously Archbishop. On August 15th in 1996, Father Alexandro Pezzet was informed by a woman in the congregation that she'd found a host on a candle holder that was at the back of the church. And so the priest, naturally, he followed canon law to make sure it was properly disposed of. And that involved placing it in a glass of water for it to dissolve. However, this host, it didn't dissolve. Instead, it just turned into what appeared to be blood and flesh. He told Cardinal Antonio Corancino and Bishop Jorge Bergoglio, and the host was then photographed on September the 6th, 1996. However, that event was actually kept secret for some time.
It was kept secret until eventually Bishop Bergoglio decided to do something about it. I wonder what prompted him.
Yes, well, apparently after 3 years there'd been no visible sign of decay, so
Right.
Archbishop Bergoglio opened an investigation, and in October of 1999 he sent a sample of the blood to an organisation known as Forensic Analytical in San Francisco. However, the scientists who were going to be examining that sample, they were not told anything about it. They weren't told where the sample came from. When they gave the results, they did confirm that the blood was human blood and that it was from blood group AB. A second sample was also sent to an organisation in New York for a second analysis, and once again, no clues were given about the origin of the sample.
Yeah.
And this one was examined by a team of 5 scientists, which included the famous cardiologist and forensic pathologist Dr. Frederick Zagibi. And he reported that, and let me just read the quotation here. He reported, "The analysed material is a fragment of the heart muscle found in the wall of the left ventricle close to the valves. This muscle is responsible for the contraction of the heart. The heart muscle is in an inflammatory condition and contains a large number of white blood cells. This indicates that the heart was alive at the time the sample was taken. It is my contention that the heart was alive since white blood cells die outside of a living organism. They require a living organism to sustain them." And Dr. Zagibi, he further confirmed that the cells, they really should have ceased to exist in a matter of minutes if it had been kept in water. And as we know, this sample had been kept in ordinary water for a month, and it was then kept in distilled water for a further 3 years.
And later they made comparisons of the Lanciano host and the Buenos Aires host, and they found many correlations. And the DNA testing suggested the samples were from the same person. It's a common assumption, isn't it, that the Church welcomes miracles, but actually the opposite is true, because the Vatican frequently denies or defers approval of miraculous events, often for hundreds of years.
Yes, that's very true. And indeed, even in the case of the Buenos Aires Eucharistic miracle, the Vatican and the Pope, who was directly involved, they've yet to recognise that miracle.
Meanwhile, science continues to confirm sacred relics by forensic testing.
It's interesting. I'm not sure that many Catholics know about Eucharistic miracles, and I wonder how many know the origin of the feast day Corpus Christi and how that is connected to these miracles. It dates back to the year 1263, when a German priest who was on a pilgrimage to Rome stopped at Bolsena in Italy. He was saying Mass there, and apparently, although he was a devout priest, he found it difficult to believe in the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation.
Right.
A little like the example we
Yes.
discussed earlier. And in this case, when he was celebrating Mass, he'd barely spoken the words of consecration when blood started to seep from the consecrated host and began to trickle over his hands and onto the altar cloth. And despite him attempting to hide the blood, he was forced to interrupt the Mass, and of course people then witnessed what had happened. In this particular instance, the Pope, who was Pope Urban IV, he happened to be nearby in Orvieto and was told about this event. He ordered an immediate investigation, arranged for the blood-stained host and the altar cloth to be taken to Orvieto, and it's still displayed there where it's been placed in the cathedral. A year after this event had occurred, that's when the Pope established the new feast day of Corpus Christi to celebrate it. In the mid-1990s, forensic tests were carried out on the bloodstains that had been found on that cloth, and they found that the traces of blood were, again, blood group AB, which matches the Eucharistic miracles that we talked about earlier, And of course, it also matches the blood groups which have been associated with the bloodstains found on the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, which are both relics which relate to the crucifixion of Jesus.
That's wonderful. So, Michael, let's talk about the most recent Eucharistic miracles.
Yes, well, they still occur, and indeed on Sunday, October the 12th in 2008, during a Mass that took place at a parish church of St. Anthony in Sokolka, a town in Poland, a priest, he dropped a consecrated host during the distribution of communion, and again in accordance with church protocol, he placed it in a small container of water to dissolve. At the end of the Mass, the parish sister, who was called Julia Dupovska, she poured the water and the host into another container and placed it in a safe located in the parish sacristy. Only Julia Dupovska and the pastor had the keys to that safe, so no one else could get in. A week later, she returned and opened the container, and then she saw that the host was still undissolved and largely intact, but a curved, bright red stain, which appeared to be a blood stain, had appeared in the centre. The water itself was untainted by the colour. So she told the priest, and he brought in other priests to view the host. They in turn informed the archbishop, and the host was once again placed in the tabernacle. The next day, the archbishop ordered that the stained host should be taken out of the water and instead placed on a small altar cloth, which was then put back into the tabernacle. By mid-January of 2009, the altered fragment of the host had dried out naturally, and it remained like a bloodstain or clot, and indeed its appearance hasn't changed since. As a result, the Archbishop then requested that a histopathological study should be done on the host, and so on March the 30th, 2009, he created an ecclesiastical commission to study this phenomenon. A piece of the altered host was taken and analysed independently by two experts. One of these was Professor Maria Sabaniak-Latovska, and the other was Professor Stanislav Sulkovsky. Both these professors were histopathologists at the Medical University of Białystok. These studies were carried out at the university, and the tests were conducted in accordance with directives given by the Scientific Ethics Committee of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and this, of course, was in order to ensure the tests had credibility.
And what was found?
Well, when the samples were taken for analysis, the undissolved part of the consecrated host had actually become embedded in the cloth. However, the red blood clot was still as clear as ever. The transformed part of the host was dry and fragile, and it was inextricably interwoven with the rest of the fragment, which had retained the form of bread. They studied the sample independently, but both these studies were in perfect agreement. The two professors each concluded that the structure of the transformed fragment of the host is identical to the myocardial or heart tissue of a living person who is nearing death. Also, at least according to Professor Maria Sabaniak-Latovska, the structure of the heart muscle fibres was deeply intertwined with that of the bread in a way that was impossible to achieve by human means.
Golly. And then there's the Christmas miracle host at Legnica, again in Poland.
Yes, that's one that occurred on Christmas Day in 2013. The priest again was distributing Holy Communion when again a host fell to the floor. So he followed the same church protocol by picking it up and placing it in a bowl of water in the sacristy. He went back 10 days later to dispose of the wafer, but he noticed that it hadn't dissolved and had kept its shape. And he also noticed that an oval red spot had formed on the surface which had all the appearance of blood. And again, this was witnessed by two of the priests, and the bishop was of course informed about the event. By January the 26th, which was a month later, the wafer had begun to dissolve, But the oval fragment hadn't. By February, or in February rather, it was taken out and placed on an altar cloth where it gradually condensed into the centre. The Bishop of Legnica appointed a commission which then ordered the taking of samples and arranged for appropriate tests to be conducted by different competent authorities, one of which was the Wrocław Institute of Forensic Medicine. And they concluded that the sample that had been taken was heart tissue. The Szczecin Institute of Forensic Medicine was also approached for a second opinion, but no details were given to them as to the origin of the sample or any details of the previous testing. That institute used a completely different method of testing, but their results were similar. In fact, cardiologist Dr. Barbara Engels summarised their findings, and I'll just read her statement, because she said, "The material was examined under ultraviolet rays and an orange filter, and the result was clear. We were able to identify muscle fibres that are typical of myocardial tissue, with changes that often occurred during a death struggle." The blood, of course, has also been forensically tested since, and that was confirmed as human blood, type AB, again matching the other Eucharistic miracles and the blood found on other sacred relics. So, when you look at all these different miracles and different events, I really do think it's quite extraordinary that research into all 5 of the Eucharistic miracles that we've discussed, one of which was from the 8th century in Italy, one from the 13th century in Italy, another from Argentina in the 20th century, and 2 very recent ones from Poland. Every one of these has revealed such remarkably similar results. All 5 have left traces of what appeared to be blood, and when tested it was confirmed as human blood from blood group AB.
Yes.
In every case. And then in 4 of these, where part of the host had transformed into what appeared to be human flesh, again when examined, in each case it was confirmed not only to be human flesh, but to be heart tissue.
Yes.
And then I think perhaps most remarkable of all is that in every single case the blood and tissue have not deteriorated. And in the case of the Lanciano host, that's even after 1300 years. It really is remarkable.
Michael, why do you think that the public seems to be mostly unaware of these events, these amazing events?
Yes, it really is surprising, isn't it? We do live in a time when we have immediate access to information. So it could be argued that perhaps in spiritual matters we remain uninformed because we don't ask the questions.
Why don't we?
Well, perhaps we don't really want to know the answer, because after all that might challenge what we want to believe.
I'm sure you're right.
Many people now turn to science for answers to life's mysteries, and so they're sceptical about any phenomenon that science can't explain. But as we've seen, science is actually revealing evidence of these miraculous manifestations, and it's available for us to examine that evidence if we choose to. In past times, it might not have been easy to find that kind of information, but this has all changed thanks to the internet, because that allows us to find and examine the evidence, and then we can come to our own conclusions about such matters. So the days of religious indoctrination, they're over, and instead the responsibility now lies squarely with the individual.
And that's the reason for these podcasts, to provide information which allows us to investigate. So thank you, Michael.
Oh no, thank you, Jennifer.
So please join us, everyone, for the next one, and links to the website, Paranormal Matters Radio, and other Rainbow Light Studio videos can be seen below.